The blackout came without warning, as if the whole world had taken one final breath and forgotten how to let it out. One moment, the old veterans' housing complex on the edge of Norfolk, Virginia, hummed with the ordinary sounds of a winter evening, the soft buzz of hallway lights, the distant clank of pipes, the low murmur of televisions behind thin apartment doors. The next, everything vanished into darkness. Sergeant Ryan Hayes stopped halfway down the third-floor corridor, one hand on the railing, the other instinctively moving toward the flashlight clipped to his belt. He was 34 years old, a United States Marine with broad shoulders, close-cropped brown hair, and pale skin weathered by years of sun, salt, and sleepless duty. His gray-blue eyes had learned to measure a room before his boots crossed the threshold. They had learned to notice things most people missed. But in that sudden dark, even Ryan felt the small, ancient fear that comes when light abandons a place too quickly. Beside him, Shadow froze. The German Shepherd K9 stood at Ryan's left knee, tall and lean, his blackened sable coat almost disappearing into the hallway, except for the faint silver around his muzzle and the dim amber glow of his eyes catching the emergency strip near the stairwell. Shadow did not bark. He did not move. His ears rose first, sharp as blades. Then his nose lifted. Ryan knew that look. He had seen it in training yards, in storm drains, in abandoned lots after midnight. Shadow was listening to something beneath the silence. "Easy, boy," Ryan whispered, though his own voice sounded too loud in the dark. Outside, rain tapped against the windows with the patience of fingertips on glass. Somewhere below, a generator tried to cough itself awake, then failed. The whole building settled with a tired groan. The air smelled of damp wool, old paint, and the metallic bite of a storm pushing in from the bay. Ryan had come here to check on a retired corporal from his unit, a man who had stopped answering calls after losing his wife that fall. It was supposed to be simple. Knock on a door. Share a hot meal. Sit a while if the silence felt too heavy. Marines did that for each other. They showed up, even when they had no words. Especially then. But Shadow was no longer facing the apartment door. He had turned toward the stairwell, body low, tail stiff, gaze locked downward. A faint sound rose from below. Not a cry, not a voice. More like metal shifting against concrete. Then a pause. Then another sound, smaller, thinner, almost swallowed by the rain. Ryan clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the hallway, trembling over peeling paint and framed photographs of men in uniforms from wars that had long ago become history. Shadow moved before Ryan gave the command, padding to the stairwell door and pressing his nose against the gap at the bottom. He drew in one slow breath. His shoulders tightened. Ryan felt something change in his chest, the way it always did when Shadow knew before he did. "Basement," Ryan murmured. Shadow glanced back once. Not pleading, not asking, telling. Ryan opened the stairwell door, and colder air rolled up from below. It carried the scent of concrete dust, standing water, burned wiring, and something else Ryan could not name, something fragile, human, and afraid. The stairs descended into a dark shaft where the flashlight seemed to lose strength with every step. Shadow went first, silent except for the faint click of his nails against the metal edges. Ryan followed, one hand on the rail, boots careful on damp stairs. Each floor below them felt farther from the world above. The emergency exit sign at the landing flickered once, red and weak, then went black. "Shadow," Ryan said softly. The dog stopped at the basement door. His ears twitched. From the other side came 3 faint taps. Slow, uneven, then silence. Ryan's breath tightened. He reached for the handle. It was cold, too cold. The door resisted at first, swollen in its frame from moisture, and when it finally opened, it dragged across the floor with a low scrape that echoed through the stairwell like a warning. The basement swallowed the flashlight beam in pieces. Old storage cages lined the walls. Boxes leaned in crooked stacks. A mop bucket had tipped over near a drain, spreading a shallow sheet of water across the floor. Pipes ran overhead, like dark veins. Ryan stepped inside and felt the temperature drop 10 degrees. Shadow moved ahead, nose low, then stopped near a locked utility gate at the far end of the room. He whined once. It was a sound Ryan had heard only a handful of times in all their years together. Not fear. Urgency. Ryan raised the light. Beyond the gate, half hidden behind fallen shelving and a curtain of hanging plastic, something white lay against the wall. At first he thought it was a blanket. Then it moved. Barely. Shadow pressed his body against the gate, and from the darkness beyond it came a small, trembling breath, followed by the faintest whisper Ryan had ever heard. Please. Ryan's hand tightened around the flashlight. The beam shook once across the wet concrete, across Shadow's waiting eyes, across the old brass lock hanging between them and whatever soul had been left in the dark. And in that moment, Ryan understood why the dog had not barked. Some emergencies are too sacred for noise. Ryan did not move for 3 seconds. In the dark, 3 seconds can feel like a whole lifetime. He kept the flashlight trained on the gate while his mind sorted every detail the way training had taught him to do. Locked access, standing water, burned wiring, a voice from behind storage shelves where no resident should have been. Beside him, Shadow held still, but Ryan could feel the tension in the dog without touching him, the charged patience of a creature who understood danger but would not retreat from it. I hear you, Ryan said, keeping his voice low and steady. My name is Sergeant Ryan Hayes. I am going to help you. No answer came at first. Only the soft drip of water from an overhead pipe, landing somewhere in the dark with a rhythm like a tired clock. Then the whisper returned. He is cold. Ryan leaned closer to the gate. Who is with you? A pause. A breath. My brother. The words were small, almost weightless, but they struck something deep in him. Ryan swept the light left and right, searching the utility wall. The gate was secured with an old brass padlock, the kind a building manager might have forgotten for 20 years. He pulled once. Solid. He glanced back toward the stairs. No signal on his phone. The blackout had swallowed service along with the lights. Somewhere above, an apartment door opened and closed. A distant voice called into the hallway, asking if anyone knew what happened. The world above them was still ordinary enough to complain. Down here, time was thinner. Shadow stepped forward and pressed his nose to the bottom of the gate. A faint sound came from beyond it. Not the child. Something softer. A shiver. A scrape of fabric. Ryan lowered himself to one knee, careful not to splash the cold water. Shadow, stay close. The dog did not look away from the darkness. Ryan unclipped the small utility tool from his belt. It was not much, just a folding blade, pliers, and a flathead attachment he carried out of habit. Habit had saved him before, so had small tools in forgotten places. He worked the edge into the lock, testing the old metal, listening as the rain pressed harder against the basement windows. The lock groaned, but held. What is your name? Ryan asked, still working. Emily. Her voice shook. Emily Parker. How old are you, Emily? 9. Ryan swallowed once. You are doing good, Emily. Better than most grown men I know. Shadow gave a quiet huff, as if agreeing. A fragile sound came from behind the shelves, something almost like a tiny laugh, but it disappeared quickly. Ryan kept his focus on the lock. And your brother? Noah. He is 4. The metal scraped under his tool. Where are your parents? Silence. Not empty silence. The kind that carries weight. Ryan stopped prying for a moment, then softened his voice. You do not have to answer that right now. He heard Emily draw in a breath that broke halfway through. Mom works nights at the hospital. Mrs. Whitaker was watching us. The lights went out. Noah was scared. We came down because we heard our cat behind the laundry room. The door shut. Then the shelf fell. I tried to call, but my phone died. Ryan closed his eyes for half a second. 2 children. A failed power system. A basement no one checked because adults always assumed children were upstairs where they belonged. Shadow suddenly turned his head toward the far wall. His ears angled toward a low humming sound. Ryan heard it too. A faint electrical buzz behind the utility panels, weak but unstable, like a beehive buried in concrete. The smell of burned wiring grew sharper. Emily, Ryan said, firmer now. I need you and Noah to stay away from the wall with the metal boxes. Can you do that? We are behind the shelf. I cannot move it. The words were careful, brave, too brave for 9 years old. Ryan returned to the lock with more urgency. The old brass finally gave a small crack, but it did not open. He adjusted the tool, jaw tightening, rainwater and sweat mixing at his temples. In the flashlight beam, his dog tags shifted against his chest, dull silver catching one brief spark of light. They had belonged to him, but one tag on the chain was not his. It had belonged to Corporal Daniel Mercer. the friend who used to say that fear was just the soul asking for backup. Daniel had been the one who found Shadow in a military kennel years before, a young German shepherd too intense for most handlers, too watchful, too stubborn, too loyal to give up on. Ryan had not wanted a dog then. He had not wanted anything alive depending on him. But Daniel had smiled, placed the leash in Ryan's hand, and said, "Some partners do not ask permission. They just arrive." Now Shadow stood in a flooded basement in Norfolk, staring into the dark as if he had been born for this exact minute. The lock snapped open. Ryan pulled the gate wide, and the hinges shrieked softly. Shadow slipped through first, moving with careful purpose between toppled boxes and slick patches of water. Ryan followed, ducking beneath a hanging sheet of plastic. The flashlight found the fallen shelving unit at the back corner. Behind it, Emily Parker sat wedged between a storage crate and the wall, one arm wrapped around a small boy in a dinosaur pajama shirt. Noah's eyes were closed, his cheeks pale in the cold light, but his chest rose and fell. Emily had tucked her own sweater around him, leaving her arms bare and trembling. Shadow went to them gently, lowering himself to the floor so his face was level with hers. Emily stared at the dog, and for the first time since Ryan had heard her voice, her expression changed. The fear did not leave, but hope entered beside it. "He found us," she whispered. Ryan crouched near the shelf and tested its weight. Too heavy to lift cleanly, too unstable to shove blindly. Above them, the buzzing behind the wall grew louder, and the flashlight flickered once in Ryan's hand. Shadow turned toward the sound and gave one low warning growl. Ryan looked at the children, then at the water creeping slowly across the floor toward the utility boxes, and he knew the rescue had only just begun. Ryan shifted the flashlight from the children to the fallen shelf, studying every angle before he touched it again. The metal frame had come down sideways, pinning a stack of plastic bins against the wall and creating a narrow pocket where Emily and Noah had been trapped. It had missed them by inches. Not luck, Ryan thought. Mercy wearing work gloves. He set the flashlight upright on a crate, letting the beam spill across the corner, then eased one hand under the lowest rail. The shelf groaned softly. Too much weight. If he pulled wrong, everything above it could slide. "Emily," he said, calm but direct. "I need you to listen to my voice and only my voice. Can you do that?" She nodded, lips pressed tight, one hand still resting protectively over Noah's shoulder. "Good. Is Noah awake?" "A little," she whispered. "He keeps falling asleep." Ryan felt the cold in those words. Children did not need darkness to become afraid. They needed adults to disappear. "Noah," Ryan said gently, leaning closer. "Buddy, my name is Ryan. I have a dog with me. His name is Shadow." The little boy's eyelids fluttered. Shadow stepped forward, careful and slow, then rested his chin on the edge of the crate beside Noah's hand. The boy's fingers twitched once, finding fur. That tiny movement changed the whole room. Emily saw it too. Her breathing steadied. "He likes dogs," she whispered. "Then he has excellent judgment," Ryan said. The flashlight flickered again, making the basement jump between shapes and shadows. The electrical buzz in the far wall rose and fell, uneven, angry, then faded into the sound of rain. Ryan needed help. He needed the main breaker shut off. He needed someone upstairs to call emergency services. But the children could not wait for perfect conditions. Most rescues, he had learned, began in imperfection. A wrong hour, a weak light, a prayer nobody admitted saying. He unclipped the radio from his belt, though he already knew the signal was poor. Static answered him. He tried anyway. "This is Sergeant Ryan Hayes, Veterans Housing Complex, basement level. 2 children trapped, possible electrical hazard, requesting immediate assistance." Only static. He raised the radio higher. Nothing. Shadow lifted his head and turned toward the stairwell. The dog's body stiffened, then relaxed, as if he had found a new thread in the air. Ryan followed his gaze. "You hear someone?" Shadow gave one soft bark, controlled and clear. Ryan moved to the doorway of the storage area and shouted upward, voice carrying through the basement. "Help! Children trapped in the basement. Call 911. His words struck the concrete, climbed the stairwell, and vanished. For a moment, there was no answer. Then, far above, a door opened. A man's voice called back, muffled but real. "Who is down there?" Relief came fast, but Ryan did not let it soften him. "Sergeant Hayes." Call emergency services now. Tell them 2 children are trapped, and there may be live wiring near water. Find the building manager and get the main power shut off." Footsteps thundered away above them. Ryan returned to the children. "Backup is coming," he said. Emily looked at him the way children look at grown people when they want to believe, but life has already taught them caution. "Is my mom going to be mad?" The question almost broke something in him. Not because it was dramatic, because it was ordinary. A child in danger, still worried about disappointing the person who loved her. Ryan shook his head. "No, ma'am. Your mom is going to be very glad to hear your voice." Emily blinked hard. She did not cry. That made it worse. Ryan crouched again beside the shelf, searching for a way to create space without lifting the full weight. There was a wooden broom handle wedged behind the crate, old but solid. He reached for it, tested it against the shelf, and slid it under the frame like a lever. "Shadow," he said back. The dog obeyed, then immediately returned to Noah's side, pressing his warm body close enough for the boy's hand to stay in his fur. Ryan began to pry slowly. The shelf rose less than an inch. Enough to shift a plastic bin, not enough to free them. He stopped, breathing through the strain. His shoulder burned from an old injury, a dull reminder from another life. Another place where concrete dust had filled his mouth, and every second had mattered. Daniel Mercer's dog tag tapped once against his chest. Ryan looked down at it, then at Emily. "I had a friend," he said quietly, adjusting his grip on the broom handle. "He used to tell me courage does not always roar. Sometimes it just stays." Emily listened, eyes wide in the light. "Like Shadow." Exactly like Shadow. The dog, hearing his name, gave a low rumble that was almost a sigh. Noah's fingers curled more firmly into the fur at his neck. Ryan pushed down on the lever again. This time Emily understood without being told. She shifted her shoulder, not much, just enough to pull Noah's foot free from under a soft canvas bag. A small victory. The kind that did not look like much unless you were trapped in the dark. "That is it," Ryan said. "Good job." Above them, more voices gathered. Someone shouted that emergency services were on the way. Another voice, older and breathless, called down that the building manager was trying to reach the electrical room. The buzz in the wall snapped once, a sharp sound like a wasp against glass. Shadow lifted his head and barked hard. Ryan saw the problem in the same instant. A thin line of water had spread across the floor, inching toward the base of the utility panels. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. That was the danger. The quiet things kept moving while everyone watched the loud ones. Ryan looked at the children, then at the staircase, then at Shadow standing between Noah and the dark. "We are changing the plan," he said. His voice had become the voice men followed in storms. "Emily, when I lift, you are going to slide Noah toward Shadow. Shadow will guide him out. Then I will come back for you." Emily's face tightened. "No, take him first, but I am not leaving him." "You are not leaving him," Ryan said. "You are saving him." The words landed. Her chin trembled once. Then she nodded. Ryan planted his boots, locked both hands around the broom handle, and drew one slow breath. The basement seemed to hold still. Rain. Static. Water. A child's small hand in a dog's fur. "Ready?" Ryan whispered. Shadow lowered himself beside Noah, steady as a promise. Emily tightened her arms around her brother, and in the cold, failing light, all 3 of them waited for the shelf to rise. Ryan held the broom handle steady and felt the shelf begin to shift, just enough for Noah to wiggle slightly toward Shadow. The dog lowered his head, amber eyes shining in the weak beam, and gently guided the small boy with a careful nudge of his snout. Ryan's boots slipped slightly on the thin film of water, but he kept his balance, every muscle taut, every breath measured. Emily mirrored the movements her brother made, shifting just enough to give Ryan room to maneuver. Her small hand clutched the edge of the crate, nails pressing into the damp wood, and for a moment Ryan felt the weight of her fear, light but sharp, like the prickle of winter wind on exposed skin. Shadow stayed perfectly still beside Noah, his tail swishing softly, a constant presence of calm amidst the confined space and flickering light. Ryan drew another slow breath and shifted his grip again on the broom handle. Slowly, inch by inch, the shelf rose higher. The small plastic bins wobbled but did not fall. Water pooled beneath them, cold enough to seep through the tips of Ryan's boots, yet he did not flinch. The basement smelled of damp concrete and old paint, with a faint undertone of the storm outside pressing against the building, a reminder of the world beyond these walls. Every creak of the shelf, every drip from overhead pipes, every flutter of the children's breaths became amplified, creating a rhythm that Ryan matched without thinking, moving with patience honed from years of service. Noah's small hand moved again, guided by shadow, and Ryan caught it gently, steadying the boy as he slid a few more inches toward the dog. Emily leaned closer to the edge, encouraging her brother with quiet words, her own fear subdued by trust in the man and the dog who had arrived without question. The buzz of the electricity, now low and erratic, became a background hum, almost musical in the tension of the moment. Ryan did not allow his thoughts to wander. Every second mattered, every movement precise. Shadow's fur brushed lightly against Noah's hand as the boy's foot cleared the crate. Ryan exhaled slowly, letting the tension drain a fraction. "Good job, buddy," he whispered. The boy's eyes opened wider, recognition and relief mingling in a single gaze. Emily's grip on her brother loosened just enough to let Ryan lift him from beneath the shelf. The child's small body was lighter than expected, fragile in the way life sometimes felt too delicate for the darkness surrounding them. Ryan adjusted his stance and carried Noah toward the stairwell, Shadow trotting close, ears flicked forward, alert to every echo, every shadow. Emily's small figure followed, step by step, guided by the light of Ryan's flashlight. She stumbled once on the wet concrete, but Ryan caught her by the elbow, steadying her as Shadow pressed against her leg for reassurance. Outside, distant voices grew louder, the sound of feet pounding stairs, the clatter of someone pushing through emergency doors. Ryan felt a pulse of hope, but kept his focus on the basement floor and the children in his care. "Almost there," he said softly, matching his breath to theirs, a gentle rhythm that promised calm. Shadow nudged Noah's back with a soft, almost imperceptible motion, keeping him upright and moving steadily. Ryan's hand guided Emily over a small puddle, the boy at her side safe in the dog's shadow, and the smell of rain and wet wood from outside began to mix with the stale concrete, a signal that they were nearing the world above. One step, then another. The basement exit loomed, faint light from the emergency staircase cutting a soft line against the wall. Ryan took a final deep breath and lifted Noah fully into his arms, careful not to jostle him. Shadow stayed beside Emily as she moved beside Ryan, the small girl's trust absolute. Now, the fear still lingering but tempered by the warmth of safety. The outside air hit Ryan's face, cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet asphalt, and he felt the tension begin to ease, the long minutes of effort giving way to a slower, steadier heartbeat. Voices from the stairwell greeted them, relief palpable, and Ryan allowed himself a small smile, the kind that acknowledged survival, courage, and the quiet heroism of the dog at his side. Shadow shook once, droplets flying in soft arcs, then settled beside Emily, watching the scene with steady, unyielding eyes. Ryan placed Noah gently on the first landing, ensuring both children were stable, and looked up at the faces emerging from above, strangers in uniforms now aware of the danger below. The small group took a step back, giving Ryan room, but he did not release the children until he was certain, guided by Shadow's calm vigilance. For the first time since entering the basement, Ryan allowed himself a moment to survey the dark, water-stained room and the shelf they had just shifted. It was still, safe, silent. He breathed again, a long, measured exhale that carried away the last of the tension. Shadow lifted his head and gave one soft wuff, almost a sigh, then pressed himself against the children as if to say, "We are here, together, and the danger is past." Emily's small fingers curled into his fur, Noah nestled beside her, and Ryan watched them, understanding that the act of presence, calm, and trust had carried them through the darkness. The storm outside rumbled faintly, rain lashing against windows, but it was no longer a threat. The basement, once a maze of shadows and uncertainty, had become a corridor of survival and quiet miracles, a testament to instinct, courage, and unwavering loyalty. The first landing filled with people within minutes, but the darkness still made everyone move like they were inside a church after the candles had burned low. A retired Navy corpsman from the second floor knelt beside Noah with a blanket from someone's apartment, speaking softly as he checked the boy's breathing and pulse. Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly neighbor who had been watching the children, stood near the wall in a robe and slippers, one hand pressed to her chest, her face pale with guilt and worry. She kept saying she had only looked away for a moment when the lights failed, only one moment, as if repeating it could undo the hour that followed. Ryan did not blame her. Darkness had a way of finding the small gaps in ordinary life. Shadow stayed beside Emily, his damp coat pressed against her knee, accepting the tight grip of her fingers without moving away. The little girl had not cried yet. That concerned Ryan more than tears would have. Tears meant the body had decided it was safe enough to break. Emily still sat too straight, watching every adult, every flashlight, every closed door, as though the basement might reach up and take her brother again if she looked away. Ryan crouched in front of her, careful not to crowd her. "Emily, you did everything right." She looked at him, then at Noah wrapped in the blanket. "I let him come with me." "You stayed with him," Ryan said. "That matters more." Her lips pressed together. Shadow gently leaned his shoulder into her leg, and only then did the child take her first shaking breath. It came out broken, small, and human. The sound moved through the landing more deeply than any alarm could have. A woman from upstairs wiped her eyes. Someone whispered a prayer. Outside, through the narrow stairwell window, red and white lights finally flashed across the rain-slicked parking lot. The glow pulsed against the walls, turning the faces around Ryan into brief portraits of fear and relief. Emergency responders entered with measured urgency, carrying medical bags, waterproof radios, and the calm authority of people trained to bring order into confusion. Ryan stepped aside, gave a clear report, and pointed toward the basement. Water near the utility panels. Children were trapped behind fallen shelving. Possible live wiring. Main power needs confirmation before anyone goes deeper. One firefighter nodded and repeated the information into his radio. Another wrapped Emily in a silver thermal blanket. She accepted it without taking her hand from Shadow's fur. Noah stirred as paramedics checked him, blinking at the ceiling. Lights from their equipment. "Where is the dog?" he whispered. Shadow lowered his head until his nose touched the edge of the blanket. Noah's fingers found him again. The boy smiled faintly, the smallest sunrise in the stairwell. Ryan felt something loosen inside his ribs, something he had not realized he had been holding since the blackout began. Then a voice cut through from the entrance below. "Sergeant Hayes?" Ryan turned. A building manager in a soaked jacket stood near the basement door, rainwater dripping from his sleeves, holding a ring of keys with trembling hands. He was a white-haired man named Carl Benton, thin and bent slightly at the shoulders, the kind of man who looked as if he had spent years apologizing to old pipes and stubborn boilers. "We shut the main breaker," Carl said. "Fire department has it locked out now." Ryan nodded. "Good." Carl did not move. His eyes flicked toward the children, then down toward the basement. "There is something else down there." The stairwell seemed to quiet around those words. Ryan looked at him carefully. "What do you mean?" Carl swallowed. "An old service room behind the laundry cages. It was sealed before I took over. I thought it was empty." Shadow's ears rose. Not sharply this time. Slowly, like a memory waking. Emily looked up from the blanket. "The tapping came from there before the shelf fell," she whispered. Ryan felt the air change again. He had thought the rescue was complete. Everyone had. But Shadow turned toward the basement door and stood. His body did not show fear. It showed certainty. One firefighter raised a hand. "We can take it from here, Sergeant." Ryan respected that. He stepped back. But Shadow did not. The dog moved to the top of the basement stairs and stopped, glancing over his shoulder at Ryan. It was the same look from the third-floor hallway. Not asking. Telling. Ryan's throat tightened. The responders had the equipment now. The danger had lowered. But Shadow had found something before any human did, and Ryan had learned long ago not to dismiss a faithful creature when heaven seemed to be speaking through his nose and ears. "He is still alerting," Ryan said quietly. The firefighter studied Shadow, then Ryan. "You trust him?" Ryan looked at the German shepherd, at the wet fur along his spine, at the silver muzzle, at the amber eyes that had watched over 2 children in the dark without panic. "With my life." The firefighter nodded once. "Then stay behind me. We go slow." Ryan touched Emily's shoulder before leaving. "You are safe now." She nodded, but her eyes followed Shadow. He is going back. Just for a minute. Her small voice thinned. Tell him thank you. Ryan looked down at Shadow, and for reasons he could not explain, those words seemed heavier than any command. They descended again, this time with stronger lights, boots splashing through shallow water, radios crackling softly. The basement looked different with help inside it. Less like a monster, more like a wounded room. The fallen shelf stood where Ryan had left it, bent but still. The utility panels were marked and taped off. Rainwater ticked against the high windows. Shadow led them past the storage cages, past the laundry machines, past the place where Emily and Noah had been trapped, and stopped at the far wall where a sheet of warped plywood covered a narrow service door Ryan had not noticed before. There, beneath the plywood, lay an old red collar, faded almost pink with age. Shadow lowered his nose to it and went completely still. Ryan felt the dog tags at his chest touch together with a soft click. Daniel Mercer's tag against his own. A sound like two paths meeting. Carl Benton, standing behind them with a flashlight, whispered, "That belonged to Captain Whitaker's dog." Ryan turned slightly. Mrs. Whitaker's husband. Carl nodded. Marine. Passed years ago. People said his shepherd disappeared the same winter he did. She never stopped looking. Shadow lifted his head. Behind the sealed door, from somewhere in the darkness, came one faint sound. Not a child. Not a pipe. A weak scratch against wood. Ryan's skin prickled beneath his wet jacket. The firefighter raised his light. Something is alive in there. Shadow stepped closer to the old collar and gave one low, trembling whine. Ryan understood then that this night had never been about one rescue alone. Sometimes, mercy opens one door so it can lead you to another. The firefighter handed Ryan a pair of work gloves, then crouched in front of the warped plywood with his flashlight angled low. His name badge read Morales, and his voice carried the steady patience of a man who had learned not to rush old buildings or frighten living things. "We are going to take this off clean," he said. "No sudden pulling. If there is an animal inside, we do not want to scare it deeper." Ryan nodded and slipped the gloves over his wet hands. Shadow remained close to the faded red collar, nose lowered, chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. The old collar looked too small beneath the harsh light, its brass buckle green with age, its leather cracked from years of damp air. It had once belonged to a dog somebody loved. That was what struck Ryan most. Not the mystery, not the sealed room, the love. It still clung to the object like a faint scent no darkness could erase. Carl Benton stood behind them, twisting the key ring in his fingers. "Captain Whitaker used to live on the first floor," he said quietly, as if confessing to the basement itself. "Richard Whitaker, United States Marine. White man, tall, quiet. Always wore his service cap even after retirement. His wife, Margaret, she is the lady upstairs. They never had children. That shepherd was their whole world after he came home sick." Ryan glanced back. "What was the dog's name?" Carl swallowed. "Grace." Shadow's ears shifted at the word. Ryan looked down at him, and for a moment the German shepherd seemed less like an animal following scent and more like a witness standing before a grave that had not been marked. Morales worked the edge of a pry bar beneath the plywood. The wood sighed as it loosened, damp fibers cracking softly, not violently, just giving way after years of being forgotten. Another firefighter aimed a light into the gap. Dust floated out in pale ribbons. Shadow whined once, high and brief. From behind the door came the faint scratch again, then a sound almost too gentle to call a whimper. Ryan felt his throat tighten. Morales paused. "That is recent. Could be a stray that found a way in from the crawl." "Space," Carl said. "There are vents behind the old laundry duct." His voice shook with the possibility, with hope, with guilt. The plywood came free and was passed back carefully. Beneath it stood a narrow service door, painted gray long ago and blistered now by dampness. There was no handle on the outside, only a small latch fastened with a rusted slide bolt. Morales worked it slowly. The bolt resisted, then loosened with a scrape. Ryan crouched beside Shadow, placing one hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. "Easy, boy. We go slow." The door opened 6 inches. A stale breath of air slipped out, smelling of dust, cold cement, and old cloth. Shadow leaned forward, not pushing, only listening. Morales widened the opening with his boot braced against the frame, and the flashlight entered first. The service room was no bigger than a walk-in closet, with exposed pipes along one wall and a collapsed cardboard box near the back. A narrow vent at floor level had rusted through, leaving a gap just large enough for a small animal to enter. Curled beside the box, trembling under a sheet of torn insulation, was a young German Shepherd mix, thin, soaked, and barely more than a pup. Her coat was sable, but dulled by dust. Her paws were muddy. One ear stood upright, the other folded at the tip in a way that made her look younger than she probably was. She blinked against the light and did not try to run. Shadow took one step forward and lowered himself to the floor. The room went still. The firefighters did not speak. Ryan did not speak. The little dog stared at Shadow, then at the red collar on the concrete outside the door. Her nose twitched. Slowly, she crawled forward on her belly, not from weakness alone, but from uncertainty, from the kind of fear made by too many closed doors. Shadow did not crowd her. He simply waited. Ryan had seen men fail at that simple mercy. Waiting, giving another soul enough space to choose trust. The young shepherd reached the threshold and stopped. Her eyes were amber, lighter than Shadow's, and filled with the exhausted confusion of a creature who had survived by staying quiet. Around her neck was a frayed piece of blue nylon, no tags. Ryan extended his hand palm down, several inches away from her nose. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered. "You found the wrong basement and the right night." The little dog sniffed once. Then she looked past him toward the faded red collar. Carl Benton made a small sound behind Ryan. "Captain Whitaker used to keep Grace's collar down here after she disappeared. Margaret said he could not bear to throw it away. When he passed, she asked that it stay where he left it." Ryan looked at the pup again. No, she was not Grace. Too young, too alive in the present. But something in the moment folded time over itself. An old collar, a new stray, a widow upstairs who had been carrying the same unanswered grief for years. Shadow had not found the lost dog from long ago. He had found the place where the loss had been kept. And now, inside that forgotten room, he had found a trembling creature waiting for someone to notice she still existed. Morales knelt and opened a thermal blanket. "We should bring her up. Animal control can meet us here." The little dog recoiled slightly at the crinkle of the blanket. Shadow shifted between her and the sound, not blocking the firefighter, only calming the space with his body. Ryan reached into his jacket pocket and found the small protein bar he had brought for his visit upstairs. He broke off a piece and held it out flat. The pup hesitated, sniffed, and took it with delicate care. Emily's voice drifted faintly from the stairwell above. "Did you find something?" Ryan looked toward the sound, then back at the young shepherd. "Yes," he called softly. "Someone little." The answer traveled upward, and a hush followed, the kind that made room for tenderness. The pup took another step, then another. Finally, with a shiver that seemed to pass through every bone in her body, she came fully out of the service room and pressed herself against Shadow's chest. Shadow lowered his head over her neck, a quiet shelter made of fur and breath. Ryan looked away for a second, because some moments deserve privacy even when they happened in front of everyone. Morales wrapped the blanket around the pup from behind, slow and careful. This time she did not resist. Ryan lifted her gently, feeling how light she was, how fiercely her small heart worked beneath his hands. As they turned toward the stairs, Carl picked up the red collar and held it like a relic. "Margaret should see this," he whispered. Ryan nodded. "She should." They climbed from the basement in a line of flashlights and soft footsteps, Shadow walking at Ryan's side, his gaze never leaving the bundle in Ryan's arms. At the first landing, Emily sat up straighter beneath her silver blanket. Noah, still wrapped and sleepy, smiled when he saw the pup. Mrs. Whitaker stood behind them, one hand resting against the wall. When Carl placed the faded red collar into her palm, her breath caught. She stared at it for a long moment, and the years crossed her face without making a sound. Then Ryan stepped forward with the rescued pup. The old woman looked from the trembling dog to Shadow, then down at the collar again. Her eyes filled, not with the sharp pain of loss, but with something softer, something returning. "Grace always brought home strays," she whispered. The young shepherd lifted her head at the sound of that name, and in the stairwell's dim emergency light, two wounded histories seemed to recognize each other without needing proof. Margaret Whitaker did not reach for the pup right away. She stood beneath the dim emergency light with Grace's old red collar resting across her open palm, staring as if the years had placed something impossible there and asked her to believe it gently. The firefighters moved around her with practiced care, checking the stairwell, speaking into radios, guiding residents away from the basement door, but Margaret seemed to hear none of it. Her silver hair had come loose from its bun, and the sleeve of her robe trembled where her fingers pressed against the cracked leather. Ryan held the young shepherd close against his chest, feeling the tiny shivers move through her thin frame. Shadow stood between Ryan and the children, watchful but calm, his wet fur drying in uneven ridges along his back. Emily had scooted closer to Noah, both of them wrapped in blankets, both of them watching the old woman with the solemn attention children give to grown-up sorrow when it finally shows itself. Grace always hated storms, Margaret whispered. Her voice did not ask anyone to answer. Richard would sit with her in the laundry room because she liked the warm pipes. He said every living thing deserves a place to feel safe. The pups had lifted slightly, not because she knew the story, not because she understood names or grief or the cruel patience of time. She lifted her head because Margaret's voice carried something soft enough to trust. Ryan stepped closer but kept his movements slow. "Ma'am." She came through a rusted vent behind the old service room. "We do not know how long she was down there." Margaret nodded without taking her eyes off the dog. "Long enough to be afraid." That answer quieted Ryan more than any question could have. The paramedics finished checking Noah and Emily, and one of them gently suggested transport for evaluation. Emily shook her head at first until Ryan knelt beside her. "Hospital is just to make sure the cold did not win any little battles we missed," he said. "Your mom will meet you there." Emily looked toward the entry doors, where rain streaked the glass and emergency lights painted the night in red. "She is coming?" "She is on her way," the paramedic said kindly. Norfolk General called her unit. She left as soon as she heard. The words loosened something in Emily's face. She leaned into Shadow one last time, wrapping both arms around his neck. Shadow accepted the embrace with the stillness of a soldier receiving a medal he did not know he had earned. Noah reached from his blanket and patted the dog's shoulder. "Bye, Shadow," he murmured. "You are a good boy." Ryan swallowed and looked away toward the stairwell wall. Sometimes praise sounded different when it came from a child who had been carried out of darkness. It sounded cleaner, closer to truth. As the children were guided toward the waiting ambulance, the little shepherd in Ryan's arms began to stir. She watched them go with wide amber eyes, then tucked her nose against Ryan's jacket. Margaret noticed the gesture. "She is exhausted." "Yes, ma'am." "Hungry too, I imagine." "Most likely." Margaret's hand closed gently around the red collar. "I have chicken broth upstairs. Plain. No seasoning." Richard used to say it was Grace's emergency dinner when she decided the world had become too heavy. A faint smile touched her mouth, then disappeared under the weight of memory. Ryan looked at Morales, who nodded toward the paramedics. "Animal control is delayed because of the storm. A veterinarian is being contacted, but she is stable enough to warm up here if someone can keep eyes on her." Margaret straightened slightly. The change was small, but Ryan saw it. Her shoulders, bent by guilt and fear an hour earlier, found a fragile line of purpose. "Then bring her to my apartment." Carl Benton opened his mouth as if to object, then thought better of it. Maybe he too understood that some rooms need more than repairs after a storm. Some rooms need a living heartbeat. Ryan followed Margaret up the stairs, Shadow beside him, Morales trailing behind with a medical blanket and a small emergency lamp. The building remained without power, but residents had opened their doors now. Candles and battery lanterns glowed on hallway tables. Faces peered out, softened by concern. Word had moved faster than electricity. 2 children were safe. A dog had found them. Another dog had been found below. By the time they reached Margaret's first-floor apartment, the hallway had fallen into a respectful hush. Inside, her home smelled of lavender soap, old books, and the faint sweetness of cinnamon tea gone cold. Photographs lined the wall near the entryway. A young Margaret in a blue dress beside a tall white Marine in uniform. Richard Whittaker smiling with one hand on the head of a proud German shepherd wearing the same red collar. Christmas mornings. Porch sunsets. A life built quietly and then left too empty. Ryan paused before the photograph of Grace. The dog had the same steady eye Shadow carried now, the look of an animal that did not merely live beside people, but watched over them. Margaret saw him looking. Richard said she was never just ours, she said. He said she belonged to whoever needed her most that day. Ryan lowered the rescued pup onto a thick towel near the couch. Shadow lay down a few feet away, close enough to comfort, far enough not to frighten. Margaret brought a shallow bowl of warm broth and set it down with trembling care. The young shepherd sniffed, hesitated, then began to drink. Small sounds filled the apartment. Rain against the window. The pup lapping broth. Shadow breathing steadily. Margaret eased into the armchair as if her body had suddenly remembered its age. Grace's collar rested on her lap. Ryan stood nearby, unsure whether to leave, unsure whether staying might intrude. Then Margaret spoke without looking up. When Richard passed, people brought casseroles, flowers, cards. They meant well. But after they left, the apartment became so quiet I could hear my own heart and resent it for continuing. Ryan felt those words settle over the room. Shadow lifted his head. Margaret ran her thumb over the old brass buckle. Tonight, when the lights went out and Emily called for help, I froze. I could not find the flashlight. I could not find the keys. I could not even find my own courage. Ryan said softly, "You came downstairs. Too late." "No," he said. "You were there when they came out. That matters." Margaret finally looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but steady. And this little one. The pup finished drinking and leaned, unexpectedly, against Margaret's slipper. The old woman's breath caught. Not sharply this time. Tenderly. Ryan watched the contact happen, so small it could have been missed by anyone in a hurry. The dog had chosen the nearest warmth. Or maybe something deeper. Margaret lowered one hand, palm open, and waited. The pup sniffed her fingers. Then she rested her chin on Margaret's foot. Shadow gave a soft sigh from the rug, as if his work had reached the part no command could teach. Ryan thought of Daniel Mercer, of the dog tag against his chest, of all the times Mercy had arrived late enough to be doubted and still exactly on time. Outside, the storm began to weaken. Inside, in an apartment lit by one small emergency lamp, Margaret Whitaker whispered, "Hello, little one." The pup closed her eyes, and the silence that followed was not empty anymore. The rain had eased to a soft patter against the apartment windows, carrying a clean, wet scent that mixed with the faint smell of the chicken broth on the stove. Ryan knelt on the rug beside the young shepherd, now calm and tucked against Margaret's slipper, letting her warmth seep into her small body. Shadow lay nearby, ears flicking occasionally, alert to every creak and whisper in the apartment. Emily and Noah sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, their eyes still wide but softened by the safety Ryan had provided. Margaret poured a cup of warm water for the pup and set it carefully on the floor. The dog sniffed it, then lapped gently, taking cautious sips, as if testing the security of this place. Ryan studied the apartment around him, noticing the framed photographs of Richard Whitaker in uniform, the small medals displayed on a shelf, the books stacked haphazardly near the windowsill. They were reminders of a life that had been full of purpose and care, and now a room reclaimed by silence and a sense of waiting. "Do you want to name her?" Margaret asked, voice low, almost reverent. Ryan looked down at the pup, amber eyes meeting his gray-blue ones. The dog had survived darkness, water, cold, and isolation, but she had not lost her trust. "Yes," he said finally. "We will call her Hope." The word felt right, carrying weight without noise. Emily whispered it under her breath, as if tasting it, and Noah repeated it softly after her, the sound making the pup lift her head and tilt it curiously. Shadow gave a low rumble, almost a chuckle, a sound Ryan had learned meant approval. The small apartment became a sanctuary in that instant, the room no longer a place of fear, but a quiet testament to perseverance and trust. Ryan helped Emily and Noah settle on a couch with pillows, keeping Shadow between them and the new pup. The children stroked Hope's damp fur carefully, their movements gentle, learning the rhythm of care and comfort. Outside, the rain slackened further, wind pushing the branches against the window, making shadows dance lightly across the walls. Ryan felt a pulse of quiet pride mixed with relief. Not for himself, for the children, for the pup who had survived the basement, for Shadow who had guided them through uncertainty with unwavering loyalty. Margaret watched the interactions, the tension that had hung over the apartment since the blackout slowly dissolving into soft laughter and quiet murmurs. "Richard would have been proud," she said, eyes moist, voice catching once before steadying. Ryan nodded, letting the weight of the words sink in. Hope nudged herself closer to Shadow, tail flicking softly, settling into the rhythm of the apartment, the rhythm of trust restored. Ryan allowed himself to relax just enough to see the entire tableau. Children safe and alert, Margaret breathing steadily, the young dog discovering warmth for the first time, and Shadow maintaining his silent vigilance. The apartment was no longer just four walls and furniture. It was a place of renewed faith, a convergence of past devotion and present care. Ryan adjusted the small blanket around Hope, pressing it lightly against her fur. "You are safe now," he whispered. The pup looked up at him, head tilting slightly, amber eyes shining with a hint of something unspoken, gratitude perhaps, or recognition of the hand that had guided her from darkness to light. Emily and Noah giggled softly, their laughter bouncing off the walls, mingling with the distant rhythm of the softened rain. Margaret sat back in her chair, hands folded over the red collar, watching the interplay with a quiet smile that carried relief, memory, and reverence all at once. Ryan glanced at Shadow, who gave a faint sigh, resting his head on his paws but keeping his eyes open, scanning the apartment and the hallway beyond. Everything had changed in the last hour, and yet nothing had moved too fast. The calm, the trust, the careful attention to one another had woven a space where safety felt tangible, where courage had been tested and affirmed. Ryan took a final glance around the apartment, noting the simplicity of warmth, the glow of a small lamp, the quiet presence of the humans and the dogs, and the way light had returned, not from electricity, but from the steadfast choices of those who had acted with care and conviction. Outside, the first breaks of moonlight pierced the clouds, silvering the rain-streaked windows. Inside, the apartment breathed with the steady, gentle pulse of restored order, and Ryan knew that this night, this hour, would remain a quiet miracle in all their memories, a testament to the power of guidance, presence, and unwavering trust. By the time power returned to the Veterans Housing Complex, the storm had moved east over the bay, leaving Norfolk washed clean beneath a thin silver morning. The lights came back slowly, one hallway at a time, humming awake like tired hearts remembering their rhythm. In Margaret Whitaker's apartment, nobody cheered. The moment was too gentle for noise. The lamp beside Richard's old armchair flickered, steadied, and filled the room with a warm amber glow that touched the photographs on the wall, the folded blanket around Hope, the children resting shoulder to shoulder on the couch, and Shadow lying near the door like a guardian carved from patience. Ryan stood by the window, watching rainwater slide down the glass in narrow lines. Beyond the parking lot, emergency vehicles idled beneath wet oak trees, their lights no longer frantic, only soft reflections on the pavement. Emily and Noah had been checked again by the paramedics and cleared to wait inside until their mother arrived, wrapped in blankets, sipping warm water, safe enough now to feel small again. That was its own kind of mercy. Children should not have to be brave for too long. Margaret sat in her chair with Grace's red collar across her lap and Hope curled at her feet, the young shepherd's nose tucked under one paw, breathing deeply for the first time since they found her. Shadow had not slept. His eyes moved from the door to the children to the pup, then back to Ryan, as if counting every soul in the room and refusing to miss one. Ryan knew that look. It was the same look Daniel Mercer had once trusted in the field, the same look that had followed him through years of grief he rarely named. Some bonds did not speak because speaking would make them smaller. A soft knock came at the apartment door, and before anyone answered, Emily stood. Her blanket slipped from her shoulders. Ryan opened the door to a woman in blue hospital scrubs, her white skin pale with fear and exhaustion, rain still caught in her brown hair. Her name badge read Claire Parker, registered nurse. For 1 second, she looked into the room as if afraid her hope might break. Then she saw Emily. She saw Noah. The sound she made was not a word. It was a prayer leaving the body before language could catch it. Emily ran first, then stopped halfway, as if suddenly remembering everything that had happened, and Claire closed the distance for both of them. She folded her children into her arms and sank to her knees in Margaret's doorway, holding them with the fierce tenderness of a mother who had lived an entire lifetime during one phone call. Noah murmured something about Shadow finding them. Emily tried to explain the basement, the shelf, the dog, the little pup, but the words came tangled and wet. Claire kissed their hair again and again, whispering, "You are here. You are here. You are here." Ryan stepped back to give them room. Shadow remained still, but his tail moved once against the floor. Claire looked up at Ryan through tears. "Sergeant Hayes?" He nodded. "Ma'am." She tried to speak, but gratitude overwhelmed her. Ryan saved her from needing the perfect words. "Your daughter kept her brother warm. She did the hard part." Claire looked at Emily then, really looked, and the little girl finally cried. Not from fear this time, from being seen. Margaret watched them with both hands resting on Grace's collar, and Hope lifted her head at the quiet sobs, then slowly stood. She crossed the room on unsteady paws and leaned against Margaret's shin first, as if asking permission, then against Emily's blanket. The child reached down and touched her gently. Claire's eyes moved to the pup. "Who is this?" Margaret looked at the little shepherd, then at Shadow, then at the photograph of Richard and Grace on the wall. "Someone who was waiting to be found," she said. The room settled around that answer. Not every wound needs a speech. Some need a warm floor, a bowl of broth, and a name spoken kindly. Later, after the responders had left and the building manager had promised repairs before noon, Ryan walked down to the basement one last time with Shadow. The lights were on. Now, harsh and ordinary. The water had stopped spreading. The fallen shelf had been braced. Yellow safety tape marked the utility wall, and the sealed service room stood open, empty except for a few paw prints drying on the dusty floor. Ryan stood at the threshold and listened. No scratching, no whisper, no child calling from the dark. Just pipes settling and the soft breathing of the dog beside him. He touched Daniel Mercer's tag through his shirt. "You were right," he said quietly. Shadow looked up. Ryan gave a faint smile. "Some partners just arrive." The dog leaned against his leg, solid and warm. By afternoon, the sky had cleared, and sunlight poured through the first-floor windows in long, forgiving bands. Claire took Emily and Noah home with instructions to rest, but not before Noah wrapped both arms around Shadow's neck and whispered goodbye into his fur. Margaret signed temporary foster papers for Hope with the animal response volunteer, her hand trembling only once. When asked what name she wanted written on the form, she did not hesitate. Hope Whitaker. The volunteer smiled and wrote it down. Ryan saw Margaret's shoulders straighten as the pen moved across the page. A name can be a small house built around a future. That evening, as Ryan prepared to leave, Margaret walked him to the door. Hope followed her, still wrapped in a soft towel, and Shadow lowered his nose to the pup's forehead. The younger dog closed her eyes beneath the blessing. Margaret looked at Ryan and said, "I thought Grace was gone from this place." Ryan glanced at the red collar, now resting beneath Richard's photograph. "Maybe love does not always leave," he said. "Maybe sometimes it just waits for another way to come home." Margaret held the doorframe, breathing through the words. Outside, the hallway lights glowed steady. No darkness, no alarms, just the ordinary hum of a building that had survived the night. Ryan and Shadow stepped into the corridor together, boots and paws moving in the same quiet rhythm. Behind them, Margaret closed the door softly, and from inside came the faintest sound. Hope giving one small bark, not afraid, not lost, simply alive. Ryan paused for half a second. Shadow's ears lifted. Then the Marine smiled and kept walking, because some rescues do not end when the danger passes. Some continue in the quiet afterward, in the hand that stays open, in the dog that keeps watch, in the child who learns that darkness can be answered. And sometimes, when the world goes black,